So, for those of you who aren't aware, Shadowcat, which is run by myself and Mark Keating with the assistance of assorted CPAN contributors insane enough to work for me. There is a point to this, it's not just an advert, although, you know, the company did pay for my plane ticket, so I feel obliged to at least mention the name once. But we're basically commercial support for CPAN stuff, consultancy, have two sorts of customers, startups and people with lots of revenue and even more technical debt. I actually quite enjoy refactoring the things that everybody's scared to touch, but I am kind of a masochist. So this is where the motto comes from, mostly because I hire from people who I've already worked with on CPAN stuff, because that means we already know the most important thing, which is that they can tolerate dealing with me. So we end up helping out with development stuff and with deployment stuff and with, Doom might apply to the legacy code, but mostly what I mean by Doom is front-end development. You know, these days, if you're doing any sort of development that's supporting applications, it ends up being whatever your back-end language is, plus the crawling horror that is front-end. I have no solution to the problem of CSS being horrible. My approach to this is very simple. I write HTML3 with no CSS, I put it in front of a designer. When they stop sobbing, they beg me to let them write the CSS for me. But of course, the other part is JavaScript. Oh, joy! The single most annoying thing about JavaScript, classically, is scoping. You know, it's a prototype-based system. Most people do not have their head around JS scoping. Even some people who are pretty good at JavaScript don't really understand the scoping model. I like to pretend that I mostly do, but it still trips me up on occasion because it's prototype-based. So you end up with a chain of scopes going up, and then writing to things will write to the entry in the prototype. So you can actually get this in Perl if you're insane enough to want it. It is actually, I have found sometimes, if you're getting confused by JavaScript scoping, playing with one of those from CPAN for a bit, and then reading the implementation in Perl can seriously make it easier to understand the way JavaScript works. Certainly, it helped me get as far as pretending I knew what I was doing. And bizarrely, DBIX class schema actually sort of works as prototype-based, because I needed to do a hybrid class object-based thing back when we started to be able to make the class DBI compatibility stuff work. Let's say I regret making search context sensitive rather more, but I'm still not convinced it was the best idea. On the other hand, it did make it very easy to transition people from class DBI over to sensible DBIX class without breaking their running code bases, which was a great way to steal users in the early days. So JavaScript scoping, mostly you declare stuff with var. And var creates a local variable, at which point writes are going to hit that one. And that's great, that's mostly reasonable, except if you forget a var or typo something, surprise, now it's a global. And you end up dumping stuff all over the document object and then causing yourself all sorts of bizarre bugs. However, as of ES6 and certain things a bit before that, you have a thing called ES6. I bet that looks a little bit familiar to some of you. ES6 will basically go, if you want a global, you need to reference document.thing or window.thing explicitly, and it will actually catch your typos for you. I'm sorry, I am constitutionally incapable of enjoying using a language that doesn't do that, because I typo variable names so often. I want it caught at compile time, not later. But one of the fascinating things about it is actually just a string that's special cased by JavaScript compilers. And you look at this and you think that's completely insane. But actually, it's really clever, because the reason they do it that way is, it means on any JavaScript runtime that doesn't support ustrict, it's just a void context string that gets thrown away, which is it's a piece of backcompat hackery that I think is worthy of Perl, right? The other thing about var is, it's function level scoping. Again, I do not like function level scoping. My first two sort of significant languages as I went from hobbyists to people being insane enough to pay me to do this were Perl5 and Lisp. So not having lexical scoping drives me round the twist. Because, for example, if you do this, so that's iterating over an array and building callbacks out of them. Nope, that's completely wrong, because X is function level scoped, so you get the same X every time, so all of your closures have closed over the last item in the list. This is not hilarious to debug when you don't know that happens. So what you do is you build a closure with another closure inside it, and then you feed the value in by executing the outer closure to build the inner closure. Seriously, this is like a recommended pattern. What kind of entertains me is, it's actually the same pattern that you get in Lisp referred to, okay, yeah, my eyes are bleeding with this, but in Lisp, this is called let over lambda, because what you can actually do is build Lisp's let out of lambda by basically rewriting let to be that, but you don't have to write it yourself because Lisp is a civilized language. And in fact, there are tiny lists that do just define let as a macro on the basis of we can optimize that later, everything else is horribly slow too because we're a toy Lisp. The last toy Lisp I wrote defined let as a macro. But ES6, again, funnily enough, has let. So you can do that, and it behaves exactly like mine. It's proper lexical scoping. It's actually block scoped. It actually closes over things properly. It's wonderful, really. And there's also a much nicer short syntax for closures, which I completely forgot to give a slide of its own. So yeah, ES6 has my new strict, and this in and of itself makes it a fundamentally better programming language than Python or Ruby from my point of view. Python, explicit is better than implicit, except, oh lol, we'll just magic variables out of the ether every time you make a typo. No, I don't understand either. But yeah, this is, you know, that is enough to make me immensely happy. And then we get on to OO. So, yeah. Well, obviously, it's built out of prototype chaining, just like everything else is, because that makes complete sense. And we're back to most people still don't understand prototypes, and the way they interact with OO, I only very occasionally pretend to understand. So what you have to do is, to build a constructor, you define a function that takes some arguments, sets some properties on this, and then if you want to add methods, it has a thing called the .prototype that becomes the prototype of the object, so you basically monkey patch stuff into its outside scope to get methods. And, like, shockingly, this all actually works. It's very elegant in terms of having been a very minimalist language. I mean, the original JavaScript was supposed to be a prototype-based Lisp. If it had been a Lisp, and therefore actually had macros, honestly, it would probably have been a lot nicer to work with the scoping model. But then there was this whole stupid marketing tie-in, so they had to give it a normal syntax and then Satan. And we've all been suffering since. And I claim that since they bought Java, we can now blame Oracle for that as well. However, and of course there's this whole thing, if you can call the function directly or you do new foo, you should be doing new foo, but foo sometimes works depending on how people... And once again, ES6 makes this substantially less unpleasant because it actually has a class keyword. Class foo extends bar, extends is setting the prototype to bar. You can write a constructor inside there, you just declare methods in there. Oh, and also ES6 class syntax is specified to always be operating under use strict, even if you haven't declared it for the rest of the file. Kind of reminiscent of things like moops for Perl5. So yeah, that really is much more civilized. I mean, under the hood, it still sets up all of the basic stuff. If, assuming you're using a transpiler to be able to target an ES5, it is actually really entertaining to read the generated JavaScript. And honestly, I would recommend doing that because the more of the generated JavaScript you read, the better you'll understand basic JavaScript for the times where you have to still suffer through it. A special mention, although this is not actually ES6, it's just a library, there is a thing called Lodash. And it's called Lodash because JavaScript developers are just as fond of terrible puns as we are. And it's a replacement for an old library called underscore. At which point, you can get map, reduce, grep. The as syntax lets you rename the import on the way in. And obviously, I'm going to rename filter to grep to annoy the Pythonistas. And also because my fingers cannot remember filter. And I already have one slight annoyance with this stuff, which is that the syntax is map, things to map, function. So it's backwards compared to Perl5. Guess how many times it says, function is not an array. But I will admit, it does make a fair amount of sense in the fact that a lot of JavaScript collections will provide a .map method that takes the function, so it's consistent with that. Like, it screws me over on a regular basis because I get them the wrong way around. I am just finally starting to get it right the first time occasionally. But on the other hand, it is more consistent and it is kind of cool and it does totally work. So Lodash is a wonderful thing, well worth going through the entire docs for it, looking at all of the different things that are available. Means you can do some very nice functional programming style stuff. And you can basically write Lisp in JavaScript in the same extent that I tend to write Lisp in Perl5. And there's a stray dash there because I typoed a slide, never mind. Anyway, so the last time I really wrote JavaScript in anger, rather than immediately delegating it to whichever minion had annoyed me most recently, was probably 8 years ago now, and yet the project was a startup that was trying to do a single-page rich web application. Back in the days when we actually called them rich web applications. And it was a really cool project and really great idea. It was using the Dojo toolkit, which I think is still going, but I've not seen anybody using in anger for years. I used to hang out on their IRC channel, which resulted in... Do people remember there was a thing called Comet, which was basically a sort of standard for doing real-time stuff? And the officially specified protocol for Comet was called Bear. That was my fault because I happened to be around when the guy who invented Comet was looking for a name for it. And I thought getting an English reference in and a bad pun on tapestry was totally worth it. And unfortunately for everybody who had to spell Bear ever since, he thought that it was also a good bad pun. But anyway, I take no credit for any of the actual code or specification, but you can blame me for the name. But of course, back in those days, we were totally screwed on loading time. And we had a couple of other developers on the project. They were both actually competent at JavaScript, so I left them to actually work on the app. I'm kind of like, okay, we could try and do like full-on minification, packing, whatever. One, it was 8 years ago, the tools were barely there for it. And two, and perhaps more importantly, We had a vast number of features to implement before release date, and if they'd both stopped and spent a week on this, we would have been completely screwed schedule-wise. So I decided that the answer, since I couldn't actually help with the features, was to hack wetware in order to fix the problem. So, have people seen the various funny messages that come up while the game The Sims is starting? So, I independently came up with basically the same idea. I wrote a hacked up bit of completely low-level JS that required no libraries, that just faded in and faded out one of a random string from a selection, and basically just kept doing that until the rest of the JavaScript finally got there, at which point it would shut that down and bootstrap the application. I can only remember 3 of them now: loading eye candy, loading mind candy, and my absolute favourite, loading messages. But because it gave people something to look at and the sense of progress, and because it was funny, the users went off the charts over it. Like for the next fortnight, everybody was going, "Oh, loading is so much better, and this is really fun." And I'm going, "It's exactly the same speed. I'm just distracting you so you don't notice now." But you know, time flies when you're giggling at Matt's terrible jokes. And this logically would make no sense, but you know, as I'm sure we've all noticed, humans aren't actually that logical. And you know, whatever. If the users were all happy, cool, right? And then I happily retired back to working on the back-end code and let the competent JavaScript people finish the features. But anyway, so one problem that you run into is, of course, ES6 is not everywhere, sadly. So, Babel. Babel is a wonderful thing. What you do is you create a .babelrc to configure it, npm install yay billions of lines of JavaScript, and then you run that command. I normally chuck it in a shell script, and the shell script is usually called Babel because I can. I suspect there is a correct way of doing this. I am currently focusing on mostly not doing the hipster thing of install a giant boilerplate that you don't understand any of and hoping it doesn't break. So I may be doing certain things here in a lower level way than is strictly necessary, but it means that I actually understand pretty much my entire stack, and I'm always a lot happier in that case because then I can simulate it in my head when I break it. And like, well, one of the most important things that I manage to do for the people I'm working with is people can put a piece of code in front of me, I'll skim read it and tell them where their bug is without actually trying to run anything. You can't do that if you can't simulate it in your head, and you can't do that if you don't understand what you're doing. So that's my excuse for anything I've done wrong here, okay? But so basically, you edit the file in SRC, and then you run the file in lib, and eventually at the point at which you're shipping it off into the wider world, you ship the lib file so nobody else has to care that you're relying on the transpilation stuff. And that actually works out pretty well. There's also a bunch of NPM modules that are written in TypeScript but shipped as JavaScript, notably MobX, which, MobX is very much worth a look. It's basically reactive programming for JavaScript in a sensible way. But anyway, so yeah, and that's basically sorted. So in the Babel RC, what I'm using at the moment is ES 2015 is baseline ES6. Stage 2 is the extensions that are probably going to be in the next version. And then I explicitly turn on decorators and class properties. Order is important. If you put decorators after class properties in that array, nothing works. Guess how I discovered that? So yeah, warning. Although if you make that stupid the nice thing is if you miss the decorators plugin, Babel does actually give you an error telling you to add it. I should possibly submit a patch getting it to tell you to add it and warning you where to add it, but you know. But yeah, but decorators, yeah, I've not mentioned them yet. It looks kind of like decorators in most languages that hadn't already used the @ sign for something else. And basically, what happens is you define a function called decorator, that gets past the information of the function that's being defined, and then you can wrap it, tweak it, annotate it. You basically mess with it however you need to. It's kind of like Perl subroutine attributes, except useful. Having written 2 versions of the Catalyst subroutine attribute implementation, I could probably give you an entire talk on why I hate the way Perl subroutine attributes work. But we'll just move on with a small note of right. So class properties. Class properties are, well, you define a name, give it a default value, and it gets set on your object before the constructor fires. And you can have class properties with decorators. So that's actually MobX syntax. The idea with MobX is that you define things as observable or computed from observables, and it gets, if you've used knockout.js or view.js, they have observable systems that you create using a method call. MobX does it via annotations, and you get to pretend that it's basically a language level feature, which I find really, really nice. I'm still kind of at the point of, wait, I have to write my own constructor? What sort of uncivilized bull is this? So, you do is, I have a function called attribute, target key and descriptor are decorator arguments, writable is an extra argument that's not normally passed, that will make sense in a minute. Has own property says, is there a property at this exact level? It doesn't look upwards through the prototype chain. And therefore allows you to set a value directly and make sure that there's a local one, so you basically get one per layer. Pull out the attribute information into a lexical, and then push onto that the name of the attribute and whether it's writable. Now, I don't know whether this is a bug in Babel or whether I misunderstood something, or honestly whether both. But writable ended up defaulting to false on properties without a default. And that was not hilarious, because class properties are set before your constructor fires. So you now have a property set to undefined that you can't write to in the constructor, which not being able to write to it is not very useful for a property without a default. But that fixes it. Oh, and also, that ... is basically doing the moral equivalent of % brace, $descriptor brace. So it basically unpacks the entire thing. It's really nice syntax for building up hash refs and array refs and whatever, because you can just basically flatten things out into the lists with ... That has made some of my code so much more concise. Like, say this, where I have RO and RW, that just flatten out the args into an array, flatten them back into a call to attra, and then passes that last writable property as false and true, respectively. Then I need a class decorator. I need a class decorator because that's all very well, but I still don't have a constructor, right? So, function O2. By the way, the reason this is called O2 is because I managed to get 3 puns into 2 characters. First off, O2, 2 O's is OO, and given what we're rapidly heading towards is a subset of moo, that seemed amusing, and its object orientation, and the previous attempt by Bluefeet to recreate moo in JavaScript was called O.js, and I'm regarding this as a spiritual successor, and obviously sensible OO is oxygen to programmers. So actually 4 puns in 2 characters. I am a terrible person, but I regret nothing. Anyway, so if we haven't had any attributes declared at that level, we don't need to generate a constructor, so we just return the class immediately. That should say return a reg. I clearly managed to cock that up at some point and then never test it again. Pull the attributes out. create a constructor that does a call on the orig. This is kind of a manual around modifier, because bear in mind, JavaScript it's still actually a constructor function under the hood. So what I'm doing is just wrapping the constructor function, and then we do a for loop over the attributes that we got, grab the value, and then do a property definition. There's a couple of other ES6 features in here that I love. Basically, in is an iterator over the indices of something, or the keys. Of is an iterator over the values, which means you don't have to do the for var idx in yada var value equals this of idx. You can just go straight to here's a value. Another nice bit of syntax. Notice I've just put plain writable there. That's because if you do that, it assumes that you want the key writable set to a value of name writable. And back in the top of the for, I've used the same syntax to destructure the attribute meta hash to get the name and writable keys out of it. That's really nice. And I really wish we had like some spare syntax left in Perl5 to steal it. I'm not sure we do though. Anyway, and then finally, you copy the prototype of the original across and return the new constructor. At which point, you can write something like this. And then, don't have to write the constructor. Civilization, finally. But, okay, the bug I mentioned was without a default, and those both had defaults. Well, yeah. So, what I do is, if there's no default, I push the name onto an array in the attrs called required, and I actually have, at the beginning of the constructor, a check on if we have any required attributes, do a grep to make sure all of those keys have been passed. Remember I said there's a really nice new subroutine syntax? That fat arrow, the name arrow bangargs.has own property, is actually a lambda. That is so much nicer than having to type function every 10 seconds. Be warned, those auto-bind this at the point of calling, so you can't assign it as a method and have the way this.method parens in JavaScript rebinds this works. Yes, I blew my own foot off not realizing that to begin with. And then if you've got anything missing, you throw an exception, shockingly enough. So my current test case, we have a read-only name with a default, a read-write age that's required, and a method called message. And so if you log the thing afterwards, you get O2 constructor. I would really like to be able to give it a better name, but the name property is read-only. It is entirely possible there is an insane thing I can do to fix that, but currently the only approach I can think of is string eval. And I have avoided string eval so far because I bought myself enough trouble trying to do all of this in the first place. You try and construct it without the required attribute, you get a suitable error. And then if you now pass it a hash ref for construction, again using the compact syntax, and the constructor populates the values for you. Yeah, we are now in the realms of this is making sense in the same way that moose and moo make sense. Call the message, yep, it's managed to look up the value right. Create another one without a name, and the default gets populated in. And that one's writable. I do also have a test which I didn't put on a slide that does check it throws an exception when it's marked read-only. I guess you probably don't need to see that. But yeah, this is actually less typing than moo at the moment. I'm sort of wondering if I want to make something that exports RO and RW subs for moo, given at this point, basically all of my attributes are either is RO required one or is lazy. Obviously, this is woefully incomplete. For a start, the tests are basically a bunch of code at the bottom of the file because I couldn't quite work out what was people's favorite JavaScript testing framework this hour. I want to sit down and go through half a dozen of them and actually think, because I want to make a decision and stick with it. I know that's very un-JavaScript-ish of me, but they're all like 20-odd-year-old single Silicon Valley men. Of course they're afraid of commitment. But I want @lazy that takes a method, installs it as a method, and then the first time it's called replaces itself with a value to work like Moose's lazy or Moose's lazy build. Obviously, we need method modifiers. I tried to implement those yesterday through jet lag and discovered that one, yes, I was jet lagged, and two, oh God, infinite loops everywhere. I probably did something incredibly stupid. I'll have another go later. Definitely the various existing Moo-like things, because there's a couple of others as well as O.js, do have working method modifiers. So it's definitely possible somehow. I'm just an idiot. We will figure that out. Obviously, I want to try and do roles, but that I'm getting very close to out of my depth here already. So I thought maybe, just maybe, I should implement the rest of it and then stop and think that through. Hopefully, assuming they accept this talk again, by the time I get to CEU, that will already be on. Oh, wait, hang on. Sorry. My apologies to our corporate lords and masters. It's TPCEU now. Yeah, I mean, all things considered, it's close to as bendable as Perl5. Once you go down into the guts and look at things like object.define property, basically, if you're wanting to do crazy things with JavaScript, you need to read through everything in object.dot, and you also want to look at symbol, which gives you a sort of a gensim type thing. Be warned, older versions of Node.js do not have symbol. Browsers at this point generally do. A current Node.js does. I only know that older versions don't because I screwed up my $path at one point while testing and got a hilarious explosion. But the scoping's there, honestly. The scoping, proper lexical scoping is the thing that I miss the most in any language that doesn't have it. Well, I also miss explicit lexical scoping because lolgo, which has this tendency to auto-create lexically scoped variables, so you can shadow an outer variable with an inner variable just without noticing, and then everything is made of urine and you can't even find the cat. But yeah, well. Usable OO? Well, it's usable-ish OO. But more importantly, given the decorators, it's very definitely fixable OO. Which, well, honestly, is kind of very Perl5, right? So, in conclusion, is ES6 an acceptable Perl5? I'm not really sure one way or the other, but what I am sure of is I'm actually enjoying writing this. I don't think I ever thought I would say this, but I am really enjoying writing JavaScript. So I would seriously recommend having a play with stuff. And if you are curious, I haven't pushed it to GitHub yet, I haven't pushed it to NPM yet. I know I need to do both of those things. I'm proud that I got it all to work at all for the moment. Yeah, thank you for listening. And I do have something like 10 minutes left in the slot, so if anybody has questions, please go ahead. You're asking about juice on JSON. Right, so amusingly, I was actually chatting to Adam Kennedy when he first created JSON, and the guy who built Juice spent quite a while on hashmoose on irc.perl.org chatting to us about it. Juice was a complete port of Moose with the full meta model, which was both very cool and completely and utterly overkill for any purpose I actually had, and imposed a massive loading thing because it had all of the disadvantages in terms of loading time inherent with having to bootstrap a meta-circular meta model on startup, same way as Moose has. I mean, you know, Moose has got noticeably faster over the years because we have crazy people who rewrote the hotspots into XS. Obviously, you can't do that in JavaScript, so Juice is doomed to forever be like a second and a half. Okay, faster CPUs have helped, but really what I wanted, given what I wanted was a subset of Moo with pretty syntax, because I wanted to be as lightweight as possible. I mean, notice I've not even bothered trying to do type checking. I would happily take a pull request to add type checking from somebody else for O2, but I don't honestly see the point of doing that myself. I'd much rather try and integrate with Flow and TypeScript's static type checking, because it's always better to get the error at compile time rather than runtime. Because the earlier you get the error, the earlier you can facepalm and fix the bug. So yeah, Juice was very, very cool as a complete implementation of Moose in JavaScript, but that also totally wasn't what I wanted. Yeah. Technical tour de force, and if you were trying to have JavaScript objects that matched Moose objects, the ability to basically use reflection to meta-generate one from the other was way cool. But also sufficiently insane and overkill that on the rare occasions that I tried it, I ended up with a code base that nobody except me could understand or add features to. Which is obviously bad because I want to build a team and then run away to the next project. Anybody else? Yep. Current favorite single-page framework? Okay, so a lot of the projects we've got on are using Angular 1.x still, and I'm actually kind of fond of it, largely because I read through the entire source code over a series of evenings, sat in the beer garden of a pub, reading it on a tablet. So I can model what Angular 1.x is going to do in my head pretty well. 2 is really nice in terms of being more powerful, but I don't find it as approachable. It's harder to get people into than 1.x was. We can basically, I and several of my team can deal with Angular 2 fine, and we kind of appreciate the power, but we hate every time we have to bring a junior up to speed on it. Whereas React is really cool, but Flux and Redux and their ilk are, oh my god, so much boilerplate. Like every time you want to add a mutation, you have to add code in 3 different places. That's all like define constant, define constant, define constant, define constant. Okay, now you can write the one line of code, yay. What I have been experimenting with, which I think I will end up liking better, is React plus MobX, because MobX integrates with React, so if you build an observable object in MobX, you can basically connect it to a React component with another decorator, and when you change a property on the object in MobX, the React stuff automatically re-renders itself, but only the bits that need to. Basically, it cooperates very nicely, and wake up. Also, MobX provide, while okay, you can't just keep every version of the state going back in time like you can in Redux. MobX does track all writes and all re-renders when the debug tools are enabled, so you can go through and look at that. Basically, I wrote a couple of small things with React and MobX, and went, you know, I could almost like this. apart from the fact that there's still too much boilerplate because I still have to write my own constructor, and that led me down the path that led me to the contents of this talk. I am suspecting that I will like React plus MobX plus O2 better. I'm not necessarily sure that's universally better than React plus Redux or Angular, whatever major version they're on now. I'm calling them all Angular 2, frankly. Just the same way as I used to really annoy people by calling Solaris 8 2.8. You know, you can change your version numbers for marketing purposes if you like, but that doesn't mean I have to pay attention except in the dependency spec. My apologies for that not being a very definitive answer, but I would note Vue.js is really nice, except it insists on using its own observable implementation, just like Knockout does, at which point I can't use MobX, and the Vue observable syntax sucks compared to MobX. But it's still well worth a look. If a customer wanted Angular 2 or React and Redux or Vue, I would not argue with any of these. If I got a choice, I would probably go React plus MobX by default. That's the closest to a straight answer I can give you. Okay. We have a couple more minutes, so if there's one more. Anybody? All right. You first, then him. All right, you were just, yeah.
How do you feel in general?
Actually doesn't offend me very much, largely because I've spent like the last decade working with Moose and Moo, where defining an attribute generates out code for the constructor and accessor anyway. So I'm kind of used to my Perl5 internally transpiling itself to more Perl5. And to give them credit, the output of Babel is actually very legible, to the point where when I'm trying to work out how a particular ES6 feature works, I'll write some code using it that may or may not actually do what I want and then read the generated output. If it transpiled to ugly code, I would be much more unhappy, but it transpiles to code that I can actually read. And also, it's not CoffeeScript, which can go take a long walk off a short pier. I have other ways of describing CoffeeScript, but then the video might not get to YouTube. But yeah, I expected to be more annoyed by it than I have been, let's say. Other than that, possibly bug, possibly I'm an idiot. It's been a very pleasant experience, and because it generates source maps that mean that the exceptions come out pointing to the right lines of things, I haven't found myself finding it to be actually noticeably more difficult than running ES6 native would be. And honestly, I am happy paying that price to be able to get ES7 features early. Because without class properties and decorators, I wouldn't be able to do half of the stuff I'm doing. I mean, even forgetting this, without class properties and decorators, MobX wouldn't be nearly as pleasant to use. So, que sera, sera, right? Yeah, so will you, no?
Well, sure. Would you be in favor of prohibiting the use of bar entirely? Have you tried ES links yet? Because you do file time errors for if someone uses bar, which is not.
I think so long as you can opt out of it, that's probably a good idea. I say so long as you can opt out of it because I've always found that, this is using ESLint to prohibit var usage for the video. Yes, I think that's probably a good idea by default, so long as there is a way to turn it off, because in my experience, while, in Perl5, 99% of the time, no strict is an error, but that remaining 1%, it's basically a necessity, or at least it actually gives you nicer code than avoiding no strict would have been. There was a point during the early days of Moose where I actually tried to make it symbol table manipulation work under ustrict. I did it. The resulting code made Stephen's eyes bleed and everybody else's head explode. And we sort of looked at this and went, yeah, let's not do that. Let's just keep no strict. It's actually better for this. So, yeah. I mean, I think in general, prohibiting as many footguns as possible. Something that prohibited ever doing for something in something else without a let on the front, I think would definitely be a good thing. I'm kind of like, I have not yet run into a situation when writing ES6 where var was what I actually needed, but I have this sneaking suspicion that one day I will. So I would rather not be in a position where I can't get back to it. But ask me next year. Okay, I think we will call it at that point. Thank you very much, and if you come up with any other questions, feel free to find me over the socializing later and ask me then. Cheers.